He kept his toys in the attic and his promises in pockets she could not reach. The dark psychology of the man who never grew up was not a sudden reveal. It arrived like weather. Slow, inevitable. Patient. Emma found him on a Tuesday when the day felt ordinary enough to be trusted. He smiled at the coffee steam, folded a napkin the way his father had taught him once, and moved through the apartment like someone stepping through a house that belonged to a child. She had fallen for the quiet ease of him, the way he claimed small corners of life and named them sanctuaries. That ease was the first lesson in manipulation. She would later realize comfort as camouflage. In the beginning, the edges between them blurred into easy routines. He told stories about being misunderstood. She listened, offered compassion, and felt like a keeper for a wounded adult. He kept asking for only small things: to leave the kettle on low, to text when she walked home, to promise not to laugh at the old fears he carried. Each request had the voice of innocence. Each favor carved a path into her days. Emma's work was steady and quiet. She measured her life in files closed and plants watered. Outside, the city was a steady hum. Inside, his hands rearranged the room into a map she did not know how to read. He would borrow money for a small emergency, and later forget to mention its repayment. He would insist she choose a movie because he couldn't decide, then critique her choice as if her taste betrayed him. He called these things nothing. She called them tries to please a man who insisted on being pleased. At night, she felt the first tremor of unease. It was a small sound. The scrape of a chair moved after she'd gone to sleep, the rustle of bills tucked beneath magazines. In daylight, she constructed reasons: old habits, forgetfulness, personal chaos. At night, she kept the receipts like talismans, and her stomach made room for questions. Her world, once rendered in reliable lines, began to leak. He had a way of making her responsible for his calm. When she asked why he avoided confrontation, he smiled like a child apologizing for an accident and said, "I get scared." The words were soft, lived in the breath between them, and so Emma took them in, as if fear were a wound she could soothe. When she confronted him about the money, he countered with gratitude. "You always understand me." When she pressed, he became small and embarrassed, and she, with a mother's instinct, smoothed the world back into place. This pattern built a quiet grammar of guilt. Emma learned to measure mistakes by his volume of distress. If he grew quiet, she would rearrange her schedule. If he flinched at a plan, she would cancel. The guilt was precise. It named her as the cause of storms that arrived only when she stood up for herself. The manipulation did not thunder. It seeped, patient and sure. Her friends noticed a pull in her that she could not name. They saw how she avoided certain topics, how she apologized too soon. They called it codependency. Emma would later call it a living in which asking for fairness felt like betrayal. She kept their observations in the same drawer with the receipts, next to a map she could not yet read. Once, late in spring, she found a shoebox in his closet. Inside, neatly folded, were childhood artifacts: a superhero cape, a small, brittle toy soldier, a birthday card from someone named Mommy. The items were not innocent. They were relics that explained why his temper retreated into melodrama, why he would melt into hurt rather than own his choices. The box explained less than it warned. It was a map labeled only for him. That night, when the apartment dimmed and the city softened, she tried to ask about the box. He turned the question into a lesson about trauma and asked her to be kind, to hold space. She obliged. Holding space is a hard thing. It requires boundaries you have to build yourself. Emma's hands were always forming rooms for others, and she had not yet learned how to lock the doors. The pattern widened. He began to test limits with small cruelties, passive comments about her friends' choices, long silences when she spoke of promotion, an easy, mocking smile when she suggested plans beyond the weekend. When she protested, his eyes filled not with menace but with the hurt of a child who had fallen. The hurt worked like a lever. Emma found herself apologizing not for what she had done, but for exposing his sorrow. She noticed one habit that cinched everything: his refusal to accept accountability when things mattered. When an argument touched on money or intimacy or their future, he shrank into the part of him that collected small comforts and refused to grow. He would turn the subject into a moral failure of hers. You always bring up money like it's a scandal, and leave her feeling both foolish and exhausted. The manipulation here was gentle, an erosion of truth that left a new shore where she walked alone, slowly. The world she had built with him split into two registers: the man everyone else saw and the man she lived with. To friends, he was charmingly awkward, the one who brought flowers for odd reasons and told bad jokes softly. To Emma, he was a person who used charm to avoid work, who traded accountability for dependence. The dissonance became a drumbeat in her chest. Her first real act of defiance arrived in the shape of a simple schedule. She penciled in a dinner with an old friend and refused to cancel. He pressed and pleaded, voiced the small, practiced confusion of one who had been domesticated by constantly being rescued. Emma felt the guilt like a heat on her neck. She kept the dinner. For the evening, she stepped out into air that had no obligations to him. She tasted a small freedom that felt strangely dangerous. When she returned, the apartment smelled of his dinner for one, and the couch had an indentation where he'd been thoughtful. He watched her with an expression that asked for tenderness and refused to name the cost of his isolation. Emma sat without finding the words she needed. She was learning that controlling someone's world doesn't always look like shouting or rage. Sometimes it is a catalog of small requests, each one a brick. Together, those bricks built a house whose windows were her concessions. Dot in the mirror that night, she saw a woman with a map of small sacrifices etched into her face. The receipts in the drawer looked heavier now. She had not yet spoken the truth of the shoebox or said the word manipulation. Her understanding was nascent, a slow, aching crawling toward language. The dark psychology in his small acts had not yet fully shown its reach. It had only begun to teach her the grammar of permission and blame. She learned to catalog the small humiliations and the even smaller apologies, to mark their frequency like weather vanes marking wind. The dark psychology she was tracing now had a voice. It sounded like entreaty, like the repetitive refrain of someone who had never learned to stand on his own. After the dinner, the man who never grew up shifted tactics. Where before he seemed content to live inside his childish orbit, now he began to orchestrate situations so subtle they felt accidental. He forgot to turn off his phone at meetings and later accused Emma of ignoring him. He left crumbs of his life in places that would make her complicit. A text to an old lover on her shared laptop. A receipt from a late-night bar tucked in a book she used every morning. Each fragment was a tiny accusation. She did not understand how to answer. Emma's mind began to play a new role, detective and translator. She traced patterns through his actions, asking herself what earlier kindnesses had traded places with what he now expected. In quiet moments, the truth tightened like a fist. His history of deflecting responsibility now had architecture, a carefully built narrative that placed him squarely as misunderstood, and her as the one who required rescue. He told stories of being abandoned by adults who'd never given him choices. He framed his immaturity as a moral injury, something painful that needed her sympathy rather than correction. He had used trauma as disguise, a phrase he offered like a cheap umbrella. She believed him at first, because kindness was easier than suspicion, and because empathy had been her practice. But empathy without guardrails is a path that leads to being swallowed. A memory came up that summer as if it had been waiting to be. Useful, his father's voice. Low and corrective, the way the man imitated it when he wanted to be forgiven. Emma caught the cadence in his apologies and realized she had been listening not to remorse, but to a rehearsed script. The recognition landed like a chill. She felt foolish, not because she had been kind, but because she had been an audience for a performance that always ended with her fixing the scene. The more she watched, the more she saw the little traps. He asked to borrow her laptop and left his social feed open so she would see messages that would spark jealousy. He would be late for plans and then look hurt when she expressed disappointment. He turned vulnerability into a weapon by weaponizing it as a shield. Each time she pressed for clarity, he retreated into boyhood and she stepped back, as if reason were a lecture that would frighten him at work. Emma's colleagues noticed a change in her. She was slower to joke, more likely to flinch when she was asked to speak. Her voice started to hollow at the edges. She realized how much of her energy was spent on anticipating his mood. She had traded conversations about promotion for soothing texts. Her life became a ledger of compromises she hadn't authorized. One evening, after a small argument about forgetting to pick up a prescription, he turned the scene into a confession about his loneliness. He sat on the floor, arms around his knees, and spoke about fear as if it were a child's blanket. Emma felt mercy rise. She also felt, beneath the softness, the ache of being managed. He wanted her to feel needed, and he engineered it by being needy in the smallest ways. She started to test him, not with confrontation, but with small refusals. She told him she would not answer calls during meetings. She left her phone on silent during a morning she'd set aside for herself. Each test was a measurement. Did his calm crumble? Did the guilt return with a tempo she recognized? The answers came and were consistent. He reacted with theatrical hurt, then with strategic apologies. Occasionally he would seem to try a real apology, a small act of change, and she mistook those moments for a turning point. They were not. They were adjustments on a long game by autumn. Emma had cataloged patterns that no longer fit in the shoebox. He isolated her from friends with subtle undermining, a comment here, a suggestion there that her friends were shallow or jealous. He called her overly sensitive when she tried to explain her discomfort. His manipulation sharpened into a form that used her empathy against her. Each time she named a boundary, he found a way to make her own voice sound selfish. This slow tightening made her feel stranded inside her own choices. She began to keep a journal with short, factual entries, dates, events, what he said. The journal was a tether to a world where facts mattered. As she wrote, she noticed how memory could be revised in the direction of his comfort if she did not anchor it. Her handwriting hardened. Facts were small anchors. The deeper she looked, the clearer the psychology became. The man who never grew up was not merely childish. He used the language of vulnerability to control. He inverted responsibility and rewrote her instincts as failings. The manipulation had instruments: charm, performative sorrow, selective forgetfulness, and an endless, exhausting need to be emotionally rescued. It was sinister in its patience. One night, after a particularly vivid argument where he accused her of being hostile for setting a boundary, she left the apartment and walked without a destination. The city smelled of wet leaves and diesel. She realized, in the open air, that the fear she'd been living with was not the dramatic fear of violence, but the small, constant fear of being morally worn down. The realization brought grief more than rage. She mourned the parts of herself that had been loaned away in installments. When she returned, he sat at the table with a pot of tea as if nothing had happened. He spoke gently about the future, vague plans that sounded like hope but contained no real plan. Emma listened with the clarity of someone who had been studying a map. She could see the routes he drew were circular, always returning to the place where he needed rescue, and she provided it. She felt the old impulse to fix. Now, she cataloged it instead. The climax of his manipulation was not a shout. It arrived as a collapse, an everyday unraveling that asked more of her than she had left to give. The man's boyish theatrics had become a full system of evasion, and it finally met the kind of momentum that happens when small lies grow heavy enough to break. She planned a morning to speak, honestly. The words had been practiced quietly, like a prayer. She would name the patterns, present the journal, ask only for transparency and consistent action. The request was simple and anchored in an ordinary, adult logic. Accountability, not rescue. She was prepared to be kind and firm both. When she spoke, he listened with soft eyes that had always been expert at making her feel seen. For a moment, she thought she might be wrong, that his tenderness might be real. Then he began to speak the language she had come to know. The pivot from guilt to woundedness, the cloak of old hurts folded over present wrongs. He did not deny everything. That would have been too simple. Instead, he reframed. He admitted that some things were his fault, then laid the blame back on her, claiming that her tone had driven him to fear. She felt the old trap close. The next days were a catalog of new manipulations. He promised therapy and scheduled appointments, but then canceled at the last minute with heartbreaking stories of panic. He bought a book on emotional growth and left it on the bedside table like a donation. He offered grand gestures, a weekend away, a candlelit dinner, each one a performance that erased the immediate discomfort without changing the pattern. Emma realized that action without consistency was a theory of amends, not repair. Her attempt at clarity had created a tempest where his choice to remain small became more urgent. He accused her of wanting to change him into someone he was not, as if maturity itself were a cruelty. When she suggested couples counseling, he stared at her as if she had proposed exile. The room filled with the silent accusation that she had become cruel. One night, after a fight that dissolved into tears and long, apologetic silences, she found a photo tucked into the journal he had once read. It was of him at 8 years old, face smeared with cake, eyes wide. She realized then that loving him had not been wrong. What had been wrong was how love had been weaponized. He had turned dependency into a demand, and then wrapped it in hurt so that any objection looked like betrayal. Emma's breaking point was not cinematic. It was a small, steady wear. The last straw was a day when she had planned to meet an old friend from college. He insisted she cancel because he needed her, using the exact tone he had used 100 times before. She had nothing left to give. The refusal she offered was quiet and final. She would not cancel. He exploded into a chaos of self-pity so complete it frightened her. Accusations flung like toys. Apologies that were immediately hollowed out by blame. She watched him and felt a terrible clarity. She packed a bag that night with methodical hands. She did not shout. She did not dramatize. She left a note in simple lines. I need to know you can do this without me. It was not a threat. It was a test and a boundary, offered as plainly as a doorway. She walked out into a morning that felt too bright and too demanding in the weeks after she left. He oscillated between frantic pleas and icy absence. He called with voices stitched into repentance, then went silent for days. He did show up at the apartment once, standing outside and pressing his face to the window, as if to find a place where she might still be small. She did not answer. She watched him through the glass and felt the old sympathy and a new, cold understanding. Sympathy without safety is merely exposure. Her catalog of events became testimony to herself. She read her journal and realized the pattern had been the real crime, a slow theft of choice, energy, and selfhood. The dark psychology was not monstrous theatrics, but a disciplined erosion, an emotional extortion that used vulnerability as a currency. She was not the first woman to learn this. She might not be the last. The knowledge was heavy and clarifying. Healing was not sudden. It was made of small acts, reclaiming mornings, cordoning off time for friends, Therapy that taught her how to name manipulation without turning compassion into responsibility. She learned to say no and to hold that no like a shield. She learned that the line between helping and enabling is sometimes invisible until you cross it. She learned to be kind to herself in ways that did not invite exploitation. There was no triumphant final scene. There was a quiet settlement, a call from him that ended in him asking for one more chance, and a reply that was gentle but firm. She offered compassion, but not codependence. It was, in many ways, the only honest thing left to do. The closure she found was not a door slammed. It was a choice kept steadily over time. If this story made you think, subscribe for more dark truths. Because every mind hides what it fears most.